They called them rats. Churchill forgot their names. Montgomery took their victory, and Hollywood behaved as if they never existed. You think you know the story of El Alamein. You imagine Monty the hero, Rommel the genius, and the British Empire rescuing North Africa. Here is what classrooms leave out. 3,000 Australian soldiers, farmers, miners, sheep shearers shattered the Africa Corps, while London was already planning to pull out. They stormed Rommel's intelligence base. They clung to a ridge for 17 days in conditions that would break elite troops in hours. They suffered more losses than any other division in Montgomery's army, and afterward they were erased not by mistake, but on purpose. Montgomery referred to them as "my Australians like property." Churchill mentioned them only once across 6 volumes of memoirs. Rommel the enemy praised them more than their own side ever did. When the war ended, the glory flowed to generals who had used these men as expendable bait and then removed them from the record. This is the story of one of the greatest military thefts of the 20th century. Not land, not resources, but honor. If you have never heard of Tel El Asa, if you do not know what the 9th Division paid along the coastal corridor, if you believe El Alamein was won by British brilliance rather than Australian blood, then you are about to see why empires write history and why truth waits buried in sand until someone uncovers it. Stay with me, because by the end you will understand what Hollywood will never show. The finest soldiers at El Alamein were not British, not American, but the ones everyone forgot. Let us correct that. On the 10th of July, 1942, 3 battalions of the 9th Australian Division attacked German positions at Tel El Asa before sunrise. Within 6 hours, they had seized the entire fortified ridge, captured more than 1,000 enemy troops, and overran the headquarters of the 621st Radio Intercept Company. Inside were maps, cipher materials, and operational plans that Erwin Rommel guarded as carefully as his life. One strike by these supposedly second-rate colonials inflicted damage the Africa Corps would struggle to recover from for weeks. Yet you will not find this episode in Hollywood scripts or British schoolbooks. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery devoted hundreds of pages to British heroism in his memoirs and barely mentioned the Australians. That was not an oversight, but a choice. This battle became a case study in betrayal, where the sacrifice of some advanced the reputations of others. To understand how this happened, we rewind to June 1942, when panic swept Cairo headquarters, burned files. Diplomats packed luggage, civilians flooded railway stations. Rommel had just captured Tobruk, taking 33,000 prisoners along with mountains of supplies. This defeat rivaled Singapore in humiliation. Now almost nothing stood between the Africa Corps and the Suez Canal. The 8th Army retreated so fast even German intelligence struggled to track it. Units lost, contact vehicles were abandoned. Soldiers wandered the desert without water or orders. Winston Churchill called it disgraceful, yet omitted that his own decisions had stripped North Africa of strong divisions, sending them to other theaters. Blame moved downward while leaders reframed mistakes as strategy. The final defensive line ran through a small railway point called El Alamein. To the north lay the Mediterranean. To the south stretched the impassable Qattara Depression. This narrow corridor was the only place Rommel could not outflank. If it fell, Cairo would fall, the Suez Canal would fall, and Middle Eastern oil would flow to Hitler. Churchill later admitted this was the most dangerous moment for Allied forces in the Mediterranean. At this critical point, reinforcements arrived that few expected, and fewer thanked the 9th Australian Division under Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead. These men, farmers, shearers, miners, railway workers, had already survived the siege of Tobruk in 1941, holding the fortress for 241 days under total encirclement. German propaganda called them the Rats of Tobruk, intending insult. The Australians adopted the name as Pride. Morshead differed sharply from polished London generals. Short, lean, unsmiling, he ruled strictly, but knew his officers personally. His troops looked unkempt uniforms, faded, disciplined, casual by British standards, yet in battle, they operated with clockwork efficiency. When they took positions at El Alamein, some British officers mocked their appearance. One reportedly said they looked like gypsies rather than imperial soldiers. Morshead replied his men were there to fight, not parade. No skeptic understood what they were capable of. The assault at Tel El Asa became the first successful Allied offensive in months, a turning point without which victory at El Alamein might never have come. It was not carried out by elite British formations, but by the very troops' headquarters. Treated as expendable, Morshead's plan was daring to the edge of madness, attack first at night without heavy artillery, relying on surprise. The 26th Battalion led, advancing through minefields, guided only by stars and compass, because maps were not provided. After moving 1.5 kilometers under sporadic fire, they stormed German trenches with bayonets. By dawn the ridge was theirs. Inside the captured headquarters lay complete minefield maps, cipher tables, and intelligence on every Axis division in North Africa, a treasure that shaped all later operations. Rommel reacted with fury. From the 11th to the 27th of July, German forces launched relentless counterattacks. Stuka bombers pounded positions, 88mm guns shredded defenses. Temperatures reached 55 degrees Celsius. Water came once per day, barely a single canteen per man. Sandstorms clogged weapons and choked lungs. Yet the Australians did not yield. Over 17 days, they lost more than 2,000 men, roughly a quarter of their strength, but held the ridge, and with it the initiative. Rommel exhausted his reserves, trying to retake Tel El Asa, and lost the chance to drive on Cairo. 3 battalions had halted an offensive, threatening the entire Middle East. Captured German soldiers revealed something striking. Rumors about Australians spread through Axis ranks. Some claimed they were savages, others said they possessed uncanny night vision units, reportedly refused night patrols if Australians were nearby. In reality, this effectiveness came from training during the Tobruk siege, hours of night movement, navigation by stars, silent drills. Nothing supernatural, only discipline. On 13 August 1942, Montgomery took command of the 8th Army, confident, sharp-featured, determined to reshape everything. He disliked the Australians' informal appearance, but recognized their combat value. He concluded the 9th Division was his strongest fighting force. At a commander's meeting, he announced he would leave the heaviest fighting to my Australians, phrasing that suggested ownership rather than alliance. Morshead reportedly left pale, understanding what that meant. Montgomery's plan for the Second Battle of El Alamein, beginning the 23rd of October, required deception. Rommel had to believe the main blow would fall in the north. The 9th Division was assigned diversionary attacks along the coastal corridor. Officially, these were demonstrations to fix enemy forces. In reality, they meant repeated assaults against fortified positions to draw German reserves away from the real breakthrough elsewhere. The division became living bait. Morshead understood refusal would damage Australia's reputation, so he agreed, but demanded artillery support and evacuation plans. Promises were made, not all were kept. What followed became one of the bloodiest chapters in Australian military history. Assaults on the 23rd of October, then again on the 25th and 26th, drove infantry into heavily defended ground with little room to maneuver. Casualties. Mounted support diminished, ambulances were diverted elsewhere. Even while suffering losses, Australian units rescued neighboring forces. On the 30th of October, German armor broke through south of their sector, threatening a British headquarters. Major Jack Edmonds gathered 80 men and 4 anti-tank guns, marched through darkness, and set an ambush, destroying several tanks and halting the advance. The headquarters was saved, yet official reports credited unnamed reserves. Edmonds later wrote bitterly that they saved them and were not even named. By early November, Rommel retreated. El Alamein was won. Churchill announced victory, as Britain's finest hour newspapers praised Montgomery as hero and genius. Australian papers reprinted the same narrative. The 9th Division had suffered 2,694 casualties, the highest of any division in the Army, yet received little recognition. Behind the numbers were volunteers, miners, farmers, husbands, fathers whose sacrifice was total. Ironically, Rommel himself acknowledged their effectiveness. In private writings, he described Australian troops as the most dangerous opponents in North Africa, noting their ferocity, skill, and terrifying night attacks. His soldiers feared facing them. This was not propaganda, but a professional assessment. The enemy respected them, while their allies minimized them. After the guns fell silent, another struggle began: the battle over memory. In 1948, Montgomery published his account, El Alamein, to the River Sangro, presenting victory largely as his own achievement. Australians appeared only as part of the anonymous 8th Army. Churchill's 6-volume history, the Second World War, likewise emphasized imperial triumph with dominions in supporting roles. Once printed, such narrative shaped museums, schools, documentaries, and public consciousness. Australia's Prime Minister, John Curtin, pressed Britain to acknowledge Australian contributions, arguing his country should not supply blood without recognition. London reacted with irritation, accusing him of disloyalty. Curtin died in July 1945 before seeing full justice for the men he defended. Culturally, the erasure continued. Hollywood produced countless war films, yet none focused on Australians at El Alamein. Economics rather than conspiracy drove this. American films centered on Americans. British productions on British heroes. Australia's smaller market meant its story remained sidelined. Even within Australia, younger generations remembered Gallipoli, but often knew nothing of Tel El-Asa or Operation Supercharged Memory, faded quietly year by year. Meanwhile, Rommel's own papers recorded respect for the 9th Division, describing them as stubborn, inventive, and formidable, especially at night. German troops feared facing them. The enemy preserved their reputation in writing, while allies allowed it to dissolve. Who truly owned the victory? At El Alamein, textbooks point to Montgomery, but the facts tell another story. Who launched the first successful offensive at Tel El-Asa? Who captured the intelligence that guided later operations? Who absorbed the heaviest losses in the diversionary attacks that enabled the breakthrough? The 9th Australian Division executed the brutal work, while others claimed the spotlight. The division returned home in 1943. There were no massive parades. National attention had shifted to the Pacific campaign. After brief leave, many soldiers were sent straight to New Guinea, exchanging desert for jungle, moving from one ordeal to another with little time to recover. Medals were awarded. Comrades continued to fall. Families received telegrams. Official statements spoke vaguely of 8th Army successes, leaving parents uncertain what their sons had endured. So the men who held the ridge under relentless bombing, who stopped the Africa Corps at a critical moment, who paid the highest price, returned, not as celebrated saviors, but as soldiers already overshadowed by a narrative written elsewhere. Their battle did not end when the shooting stopped. It continued in books, in films, in classrooms, in memory itself, because wars decide borders, but stories decide legacy.